Imagine digging in the ruins of an ancient city and finding a clay tablet covered in strange wedge-shaped symbols. You dust it off, carefully translate the text, and realize you're reading a story about a massive flood that destroyed the world. Except here's the thing. This tablet was written 4,500 years ago, at least 1,000 years before the Bible was even compiled. And the story it tells isn't just similar to Noah's flood, it's almost identical. Same basic plot, same divine warning, same ark, same survivors, same worldwide catastrophe. Only the names are different. That actually happened. Not once, but dozens of times. Throughout the 1800s and early 1900s, archaeologists working in modern-day Iraq kept unearthing these ancient Sumerian and Babylonian tablets, and they kept finding flood stories, older flood stories, more detailed flood stories, stories that made the biblical account look like a late retelling of something much more ancient. But here's where it gets really interesting. These tablets don't just describe the flood. Some of them describe what came before. They talk about cities that existed before the waters rose, kings who ruled for impossibly long periods, knowledge and civilization that somehow emerged fully formed in southern Mesopotamia around 5,000 years ago with writing, mathematics, astronomy, and complex social structures appearing almost overnight. If you're listening to this to fall asleep, perfect. That's exactly why I make these. So maybe subscribe and tell me where you are and what time it is. I read the comments and it's fascinating. Tokyo at sunrise, London at lunch, Los Angeles at lights out, all listening to the same ancient mysteries at once. The question these tablets raise is almost too big to wrap your head around. What if there really was a great flood? Not just a local flooding event, but something catastrophic enough that every major culture on Earth has a story about it. And what if the Sumerians, writing in humanity's first known script, were preserving memories of something that actually happened? Something that wiped out whatever came before and forced humanity to start over? The Sumerians appeared in southern Mesopotamia, in the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, around 4,500 BCE. They built the world's first true cities, Uruk, Ur, Eridu, places with tens of thousands of inhabitants, massive temple complexes, sophisticated irrigation systems, and professional armies. They invented writing, not to tell stories at first, but to keep records, beer rations, grain stores, temple inventories, the mundane stuff of civilization. But then they started writing down their myths, their legends, their sacred stories. And on thousands of clay tablets pressed into wet clay and baked hard in the Mesopotamian sun, they recorded something extraordinary. A memory of the world before, a memory of the flood that separated that world from this one, a memory of how a few survivors carried forward the knowledge of the lost age. Most people have heard of Noah's Ark. It's one of the most famous stories in human history, but hardly anyone knows that the biblical version is just one telling of a much older tale. The Sumerian tablets speak of Ziusudra. The Babylonian Epic of Gilgamesh tells of Utnapishtim. The Akkadian Atrahasis epic describes a man who built an ark and saved humanity. All of these stories are older than the Hebrew Bible, some by more than 1,000 years. So what's really going on here? Are these just myths that ancient cultures told to explain natural disasters? Or is something else preserved in these ancient texts? Something we've forgotten? Some echo of a real catastrophe that reshaped human civilization? The tablets are real. They exist in museums right now. The University of Pennsylvania, the British Museum, the Louvre. You can see them, touch them, read the translations. These aren't conspiracy theories or fringe ideas. These are legitimate historical documents from humanity's first civilization, and they're telling us something. The question is whether we're ready to listen. Let's talk about something that shouldn't be possible. Around 4,500 BCE, in the flat, muddy plains between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, a civilization appeared that had no business existing. Not yet, anyway. Not according to everything we think we know about how civilizations develop. This was Sumer, and it showed up like someone had pressed fast forward on human history. Most civilizations evolve gradually. You can trace their development step by step. Simple farming villages that grow into towns, towns that develop specialized crafts, crafts that require organization, organization that leads to administration, administration that eventually creates writing systems to keep track of everything. The process takes thousands of years, except in Sumer it didn't. The Sumerians appeared in southern Mesopotamia with all of it already in place. Advanced agriculture, monumental architecture, complex mathematics, sophisticated astronomy, and most importantly, a fully developed writing system. Not primitive pictographs that would slowly evolve into something more complex. Actual writing. Cuneiform script capable of expressing abstract concepts, recording historical events, and preserving technical knowledge. It's like watching someone sit down at a piano and immediately playing a concerto without ever having seen the instrument before. Archaeological evidence shows that the region had been inhabited by simpler farming communities for centuries. Then suddenly, within just a few generations, you get ziggurats towering over the landscape, irrigation systems managing water across hundreds of miles, wheeled vehicles moving goods between cities, and scribes recording everything from tax receipts to epic poetry. The transformation is so abrupt that some archaeologists still argue about whether the Sumerians were even a native population, or if they migrated into the region bringing advanced knowledge with them. But migrated from where? No other civilization in the known world at that time possessed comparable sophistication. Let's look at what they could do. Their mathematics wasn't just counting on fingers. The Sumerians developed a base 16 number system, sexagesimal, that was so sophisticated we still use it today. Every time you check a clock divided into 60 minutes and 60 seconds, every time you measure a circle with 360 degrees, you're using Sumerian mathematics developed more than 6,000 years ago. Think about that. They didn't just count things. They developed abstract mathematical concepts including a functional understanding of zero as a placeholder, something that wouldn't appear in many other civilizations for thousands of years. They calculated areas and volumes. They solved complex algebraic problems. Clay tablets from Sumerian schools show students working through geometric calculations that wouldn't look out of place in a modern middle school classroom. Their astronomy was even more remarkable. The Sumerians mapped the heavens with precision that seems impossible for people who supposedly had no telescopes, no advanced instruments, nothing but their eyes and extraordinary knowledge. They tracked the movements of planets with accuracy that wasn't matched in Europe until the Renaissance. They understood the precession of the equinoxes, a phenomenon so subtle it requires observations spanning centuries to detect. They knew about planets that aren't visible to the naked eye. Some tablets describe celestial objects that shouldn't have been discoverable until the invention of the telescope. Mainstream scholars attribute this to misinterpretation, suggesting we're reading too much into poetic astronomical texts. But the specificity is troubling. How do you accidentally describe something you can't see? Their architecture presents its own mysteries. The ziggurats, those massive stepped pyramids that dominated Sumerian cities, weren't just impressive monuments. They were precise astronomical observatories, aligned with celestial events with accuracy that required sophisticated mathematical and engineering knowledge. The Great Ziggurat of Ur, built around 2100 BCE, demonstrates construction techniques and architectural principles that suggest generations of accumulated expertise. But where did that expertise come from? Architecture. This sophisticated requires trial and error, failed experiments, lessons learned from collapsed structures and engineering disasters. Yet the earliest Sumerian monuments show remarkable competence right from the start, as if their builders already knew exactly what they were doing. Then there's their writing system. Cuneiform appears around 3400 BCE, and while the earliest examples are somewhat simpler than later versions, it's already functional, already capable of recording complex information. Most writing systems evolved from simple pictographs over many centuries. Egyptian hieroglyphics, Chinese characters, Mayan script all show clear developmental stages from pictures to abstract symbols. Cuneiform skips most of that. It appears relatively complete, with a structure sophisticated enough to record 7 different languages over the next 3,000 years. The tablets themselves tell us something extraordinary. The Sumerians weren't just keeping tax records. They were preserving technical knowledge, astronomical observations, mathematical formulas, medical treatments, architectural specifications, and most intriguingly, detailed accounts of their own history and the history of what came before them. Their religious texts describe a complex pantheon of gods called the Anunnaki, and these weren't simple nature spirits or anthropomorphized forces of weather and harvest. The Sumerian gods were described with remarkable specificity, each with distinct personalities, domains of influence, and detailed genealogies spanning thousands of years. According to Sumerian theology, the Anunnaki came from somewhere else and brought civilization to humanity. They taught agriculture, writing, mathematics, astronomy, architecture, law, and medicine. They established the first cities and appointed human rulers to govern on their behalf. The tablets describe these gods with a peculiar mixture of reverence and familiarity, as if they were real beings the Sumerians had actually interacted with, not abstract divine concepts. Now, every ancient culture has creation myths. Every civilization claims their knowledge came from the gods, but the Sumerian accounts have a different quality. They're precise. They include technical details. They describe specific events with specific dates. They read less like mythology and more like historical records. The Sumerian King List, which we'll explore in more detail later, claims that before a great flood destroyed the world, kings ruled for thousands of years each. After the flood, civilization had to be rebuilt, but it was rebuilt by survivors who preserved the knowledge of what came before. Here's where things get really interesting. The Sumerians possessed knowledge that other civilizations wouldn't discover independently for millennia. They knew about sophisticated irrigation engineering that allowed them to farm the desert. They understood metallurgy, creating bronze implements that required precise knowledge of alloy ratios and smelting temperatures. They developed the first known legal codes, complex enough to cover everything from property disputes to medical malpractice. They had advanced medical knowledge, performing surgeries, prescribing pharmaceutical treatments, and understanding anatomy in ways that suggest systematic study and accumulated expertise. Medical texts describe procedures for treating injuries and diseases with a level of detail that implies generations of medical practice. All of this appeared within a few hundred years in a region that had previously been occupied by simple farming villages. Mainstream archaeology attributes this rapid development to a perfect storm of favorable conditions. The fertile river valley provided abundant resources. The flat terrain facilitated trade and communication. The lack of natural barriers encouraged cooperation between communities. Population density reached critical mass, allowing specialization and innovation. All of that is probably true, but it doesn't quite explain the completeness of what appeared. It doesn't explain why Sumerian astronomy was so advanced, why their mathematics was so sophisticated, why their writing system was so functional right from the start. It's as if they didn't develop this knowledge, they inherited it. Some tablets explicitly state this. They describe a time before the flood when civilization was even more advanced, when knowledge was even more complete. They talk about the Apkallu, 7 sages who brought wisdom to humanity before the deluge destroyed the ancient world. These sages supposedly preserved essential knowledge through the catastrophe, ensuring that civilization could be rebuilt afterward. Could the Sumerians have been the inheritors of an earlier lost civilization? One that achieved significant sophistication before being destroyed by a massive flood? A civilization that left behind fragments of knowledge that the Sumerians preserved, adapted, and rebuilt into their own culture. The tablets themselves suggest they believe this was true. They describe their knowledge as ancient, as inherited from the time before the flood, from the Apkallu and the early kings who ruled for thousands of years. Whether that's literal history or mythologized memory of some earlier cultural achievement, we can't say for certain. But what we can say is this. Sumerian civilization appeared with capabilities that seemed to compress thousands of years of normal development into a few centuries. They possessed knowledge that shouldn't have been available to people at their stage of technological development. They were a civilization that, by all conventional understanding of how civilizations evolve, should not have existed when they did. And they left us thousands of clay tablets describing exactly what happened before the great flood that they claimed had destroyed the world that came before them. Now, here's where the Sumerian story gets really interesting. Among all the tablets discovered in that ancient library at Nineveh, one stood out. One narrative captured the attention of scholars immediately and hasn't let go since. It's called the Epic of Gilgamesh, and it contains something that should have been impossible. A detailed account of a catastrophic flood, complete with specifications for an ark, animal passengers, and a few survivors. Sound familiar? It should. Because this story predates the biblical account by over 1,000 years. The Epic of Gilgamesh isn't just about a flood. It's an entire adventure story following a Sumerian king named Gilgamesh, who's searching for the secret of immortality. 2/3 god, 1/3 human according to the text, though what that actually means is anyone's guess. He's mourning the death of his friend Enkidu and terrified of his own mortality, so he sets out on a journey to find the one human who supposedly achieved eternal life, the one human who survived the Great Flood. His name was Utnapishtim, and when Gilgamesh finally finds him, living in a distant land beyond the waters of death, Utnapishtim tells him a story about how the world once ended and he alone was chosen to preserve it. The flood narrative in the Epic of Gilgamesh appears on Tablet 11. When George Smith first translated it in 1872, he was so overcome with emotion that he reportedly started undressing and running around the room. Because right there, in cuneiform pressed into clay over 4,000 years ago, was a story that sounded almost exactly like Noah's flood from the Bible. Except this version was written down when the biblical books were still distant, unimaginable future. According to Utnapishtim's account, the gods decided to destroy humanity with a flood. The text doesn't give a clear reason, at least not in the tablets we have. Some translations suggest humanity had become too noisy, disturbing the gods' rest. Others hint at human wickedness. But whatever the reason the decision was made, a catastrophic flood would wipe the slate clean. But one god, Ea, the god of wisdom and water, decided to spare a single man. He couldn't directly warn Utnapishtim because the other gods had sworn an oath of secrecy. So Ea did something clever. He spoke to the reed walls of Utnapishtim's house, knowing Utnapishtim would overhear. Reed wall, brick wall, he said. Tear down your house, build a boat, abandon your possessions, save your life. Put aboard the seed of all living things. The instructions that follow are remarkably specific. Utnapishtim was told to build a boat, not a ship in the traditional sense, but a massive cube-shaped vessel. The dimensions given in the text describe a structure roughly 200 feet on each side, with 6 decks dividing the interior into 7 levels. The walls were to be 200 feet high. The whole thing was to be coated with bitumen, a natural tar-like substance, both inside and out to make it waterproof. Think about that for a moment. This isn't a vague, build a boat instruction. These are engineering specifications, details about structure, materials, waterproofing, the kind of information someone might actually preserve if they were trying to pass down real instructions for surviving a catastrophic flood. Utnapishtim loaded the boat exactly as instructed. He brought aboard the seed of all living things, his family, skilled craftsmen to preserve human knowledge, and wild and domestic animals. Then he sealed the door, and the storm began. The description of the flood itself is genuinely terrifying, even thousands of years later. The gods of the storm turned daylight into darkness, the tablet reads. They smashed the land like a clay pot. For one day the storm raged, gathering speed as it blew. It poured over the people like the tides of battle. A man could not see his fellow. They could not recognize each other in the torrent. Even the gods were frightened by what they had unleashed. According to the text, they cowered like dogs, crouching against the outer wall of heaven. Ishtar, the goddess who had advocated for the flood, cried out like a woman in childbirth regretting her decision. How could I speak evil in the assembly of gods? How could I order a catastrophe to destroy my people? The storm lasted 6 days and 7 nights. By the 7th day, the flood began to subside. Utnapishtim opened a window and looked out. Everything was silent. All of humanity had returned to clay, the text says. The entire landscape was flat, covered with water like a rooftop. The boat eventually came to rest on a mountain, Mount Nimush, according to the text. And here's where it gets really interesting. Utnapishtim waited 7 more days, then sent out a dove to search for land. The dove found nowhere to land and returned. He sent out a swallow, same result. Then he sent out a raven. The raven found land, fed on carrion, and didn't return. Does this sound familiar? It should. In the biblical account, Noah sends out a raven and 2 doves, with the same basic pattern. First bird returns, second bird returns with an olive branch, third bird doesn't return at all. The parallel is so precise it can't be coincidental. After confirming that land had re-emerged, Utnapishtim released all the animals and made a sacrifice. The gods, who had apparently been starving without human offerings during the flood, smelled the sweet savour and gathered around the sacrifice like flies. Ishtar swore she would remember these days forever and never forget them. Enlil, who had initiated the flood, was furious that anyone survived. But Ea, the wise god who'd warned Utnapishtim, convinced the other gods that completely destroying humanity had been a mistake. Utnapishtim and his wife were granted immortality and sent to live at the ends of the earth, beyond the reach of ordinary humans. That's where Gilgamesh finds him, thousands of years later, seeking the same gift of eternal life. Utnapishtim tells him it's impossible. The special circumstances that led to his immortality can never be repeated. The age before the flood is gone forever. Now here's what makes this so significant. When scholars first realized that the Epic of Gilgamesh predated the biblical flood account by over a millennium, it created a theological earthquake. If the Sumerian version came first, what did that mean for biblical authority? Was the Noah story borrowed from earlier Mesopotamian sources? Were both accounts drawing from an even older common source? Or, and this is where it gets really interesting, were both stories preserving actual historical memory of a real catastrophic flood event? The parallels between Gilgamesh's flood narrative and Noah's flood are too numerous to be coincidental. Both feature a divine warning given to a single righteous man. Both include specific instructions for building a waterproof vessel. Both describe loading animals and family members aboard. Both depict a storm that destroys all other life on Earth. Both describe the vessel coming to rest on a mountain. Both include the detail of sending out birds to search for dry land. Both end with a sacrifice that pleases the divine powers. Both result in a promise that such a flood won't happen again. These aren't just thematic similarities. These are structural parallels, specific details that match too closely to be independent inventions. Something connected these stories. Either one borrowed from the other, or both were drawing from a much older source. A source that might predate both Sumerian and biblical civilizations. But here's what really keeps researchers up at night. The Epic of Gilgamesh wasn't the oldest Sumerian flood account. Not even close. It was just the most complete one we found first. As archaeologists continued digging through Mesopotamian ruins, they found even earlier tablets describing the same event. Stories that push the flood narrative back even further into the shadows of prehistory. The Sumerian King List, which we'll explore more deeply later, mentions the flood as a pivotal event in human history. It divides all of Sumerian chronology into two eras, before the flood and after the flood. Everything is dated relative to this catastrophe, as if nothing that came before it could be understood except through the lens of its destruction. And the instructions themselves, those specific engineering details, they suggest something profound. If you were living through a real catastrophe and wanted to preserve information for future generations, you wouldn't just say there was a flood. You'd preserve the practical details, how to survive, what kind of structure could withstand the waters, what materials to use, how to seal it properly. You'd preserve the specifications that might actually save lives if it happened again. The Epic of Gilgamesh does exactly that. It reads less like mythology and more like a survival manual wrapped in a story to make it memorable. A way of preserving critical information across generations when writing was still rare and oral tradition was everything. So was Utnapishtim real? Was there really a man who survived a catastrophic flood by building an enormous boat? Or is this all just mythology, ancient storytelling, that happened to be similar across cultures because floods were common disasters that everyone feared? The answer might lie in what came before Gilgamesh, because as scholars dug deeper into Sumerian records, they found something extraordinary. They found earlier versions of the flood story, versions that filled in details, provided different perspectives, and pushed the timeline of this mysterious catastrophe back even further into humanity's forgotten past. Stories that suggested the flood wasn't just a mythological event, but something the Sumerians believed was absolutely terrifyingly real. But here's where things get really interesting. The Epic of Gilgamesh isn't the oldest flood story the Sumerians left us, not even close. When archaeologists started digging deeper, literally and figuratively, they found something that changed everything we thought we knew about how long humanity had been preserving these stories. In the 1890s, excavations at the ancient city of Nippur uncovered fragments of a tablet that made the Gilgamesh flood account look like yesterday's news. It was called the Eridu Genesis, named after Eridu, the city the Sumerians themselves claimed was the very first city ever built, the first place where, according to their records, kingship descended from heaven to earth. And this tablet was old, really old. Scholars date it to around 2300 BCE, making it potentially the oldest written flood count in human history. But age isn't what makes the Eridu Genesis fascinating. It's what the tablet says happened before the flood. What it describes about the world that existed when these cities were young. The tablet is damaged, frustratingly so. Large sections are missing, lost to thousands of years of decay. But what remains is tantalizing. It begins with the creation of humanity, describing how the gods created people to do the work they themselves didn't want to do. To dig canals, to farm the land, to maintain the temples. Humanity wasn't created as the pinnacle of creation. We were created as labourers, as servants to beings far more powerful than ourselves. The text describes how cities were established, how kingship was instituted, how civilization itself was organized. It lists the first 5 cities, the places where humanity first learned to live in large organized groups: Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, and Shuruppak. These weren't mythical places. They were real cities, and archaeologists have found remains of all of them, some dating back more than 5,000 years. Then the tablet describes something that appears in multiple Sumerian sources, something so consistent across different texts that it's hard to dismiss as mere mythology. It says humanity became too numerous, too widespread, and critically, too noisy. Now, that word, noisy, has puzzled scholars for decades. What does it mean for humanity to be too noisy? Some translations use the word clamour or tumult. The Sumerian term suggests not just sound, but disturbance, disruption, something that broke the peace of the world. The gods, according to the text, couldn't sleep. They couldn't rest. The noise of humanity, the constant activity of these growing civilizations, was disturbing the natural order of things. This is where the Atrahasis epic comes in, and it tells us so much more. Discovered on tablets from the Old Babylonian period, around 1800 BCE, the Atrahasis epic is one of the most complete pre-flood accounts we have. It's also one of the most detailed, giving us a window into what the ancient Mesopotamians believed about their own deep history. The Atrahasis starts the same way as the Eridu Genesis. Humanity is created to work for the gods, but it gives us numbers, time frames, details that make the story feel less like myth and more like a historical record that's been passed down through countless generations. According to the Atrahasis, humanity multiplied over a period of 1,200 years, 1,200 years of population growth, of cities expanding, of civilization spreading across the landscape. And during this time, something remarkable happened. People developed sophisticated social systems. They built irrigation networks that could sustain large populations. They created writing to keep records. They developed mathematics, astronomy, agriculture on a scale that could feed thousands. They became, in other words, what we would recognize as a complex civilization. And the gods noticed. More than noticed. According to the text, they became disturbed. The tablets describe how Enlil, the chief god, complained that humanity had become so numerous and so noisy that he couldn't sleep. The racket of human activity, the constant building, trading, fighting, celebrating, it was too much. But here's what's fascinating. The text doesn't describe this as happening overnight. It describes multiple attempts by the gods to reduce the human population before they finally decided on the flood. First, they sent plague. Disease swept through the human cities, killing thousands. But humanity survived, rebuilt, continued multiplying. Then they sent drought. Years without rain, crops failing, people starving. Still, humanity endured. They adapted. They dug deeper wells, developed more efficient irrigation, found new ways to preserve food. The gods sent famine. They sent more disease. According to some versions of the text, these attempts to control humanity's numbers went on for centuries. But each time, people found a way to survive, found a way to bounce back stronger than before. This wasn't a species that gave up easily. This was a species that had been refined by previous disasters, that carried in its very genes the memory of survival against impossible odds. Finally, the gods decided on a more permanent solution: a flood. Not just a local flood, not just heavy rain, something comprehensive, something that would reset everything. According to the Atrahasis, the decision wasn't unanimous. Some gods objected, and one god in particular decided to intervene. Enki, the god of wisdom and fresh water, had a special relationship with humanity. Some versions of the text suggest he was the one who had originally created people. He didn't want to see his creation completely destroyed, so he found a loophole. He couldn't directly warn humanity about what was coming. That would violate the decision of the divine assembly. But he could speak to a wall. He could let the wall, accidentally of course, be overheard by a particularly wise human who happened to be listening on the other side. That human was Atrahasis, whose name literally means exceedingly wise. The text describes him as king of Shuruppak, one of those 5 original cities. Enki spoke to the wall of Atrahasis' reed house, warning about the coming flood, and Atrahasis, being exceedingly wise, understood what he needed to do. The instructions are remarkably specific. Tear down your house, the god said. Build a boat, abandon possessions and seek life. Reject worldly goods and save living things. Bring into the boat the seed of all living creatures. These aren't vague mythological instructions. They're practical, detailed, the kind of directions you'd give to someone who actually needed to build a survival vessel. The Atrahasis epic describes the dimensions of the boat, the materials to be used, how to waterproof it with bitumen, how to structure it to survive rough seas. It describes how Atrahasis gathered animals and birds, how he brought aboard his family and skilled craftsmen who could help rebuild civilization after the waters receded. Most remarkably, the text describes how Atrahasis brought aboard the seed of civilization. Not just biological seeds for crops, though those too, but knowledge. The tablet mentions craftsmen specifically, people with specialized skills, metal workers, weavers, farmers, builders. This wasn't just about surviving the flood. It was about preserving the accumulated knowledge of a civilization that had taken 1,200 years to build. When you read the Eridu Genesis and the Atrahasis back to back, along with the flood account from Gilgamesh, something becomes impossible to ignore. These aren't just 3 versions of the same story. They're 3 independent witnesses to what the ancient Mesopotamians believed was historical fact. They use different names for some characters, emphasize different details, but the core elements remain consistent across all of them. There was a time before the flood when humanity lived in cities, when civilization was old and sophisticated, when people had multiplied to numbers that seemed overwhelming to the ancient writers. There was a decision made by forces beyond human control, whether you call them gods or something else, to reset everything. And there was a warning given to a wise individual who preserved not just biological life, but the knowledge necessary to restart civilization. The consistency across multiple independent sources is what keeps scholars up at night. Because in ancient history, when you find the same basic story told in different texts, from different time periods, using different languages, it usually means one of 2 things. Either there was a shared source, an even older account that all these texts are drawing from, or the texts are recording something that actually happened, an event so significant that it echoed through thousands of years of oral tradition before finally being written down. The Sumerian tablets themselves suggest both possibilities are true. They're drawing from older oral traditions, stories that were already ancient when they were first committed to clay. But they're also describing something they believed was real, something that had shaped their entire civilization, something that explained why their cities were built where they were, why certain knowledge was considered sacred, why certain rituals were performed. And the tablets keep saying something else, something that should make us pay attention. They describe a pre-flood world that wasn't primitive, that wasn't simple, that had technology, organization, knowledge, a world sophisticated enough that its noise, its activity, its sheer scale of human achievement was considered remarkable, even overwhelming. What kind of civilization makes that much noise? What kind of population growth creates such impact that it becomes the central reason given for its own destruction? And most intriguingly, what kind of knowledge did Atrahasis and his fellow survivors carry with them onto that boat? What exactly was preserved, when the old world drowned. Because according to the tablets, civilization didn't start after the flood. It was rebuilt, restored. The knowledge had been saved, the seed had been preserved. And when the waters finally receded, when humanity stepped back onto dry land, they weren't starting from scratch. They were continuing something that had been interrupted, something that had existed before. In the world the tablets call the time before the flood. Now, if the flood stories were remarkable, they're nothing compared to what the Sumerians documented about the world before that catastrophe. There's an artifact that continues to baffle historians and archaeologists to this day, a collection of clay tablets and prisms that record something so strange, so impossible by conventional understanding, that most scholars simply dismiss it as mythology without looking deeper. It's called the Sumerian King List. Picture this. You're a scribe in ancient Sumer around 2100 BCE. You've been given an important task by your king. Create a definitive record of every ruler who has governed the land since kingship first descended from the heavens. That's how they phrased it, descended from the heavens. Not began, not emerged, descended. Already, we're in interesting territory. So you gather all the ancient records you can find, you consult older scribes, examine weathered tablets, compile lists that have been passed down through generations, and you begin to write. The list starts with a simple, declarative statement. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. Eridu, that same city we mentioned earlier, the one the Sumerians believed was the first city ever built. The city where Ziusudra received his warning about the flood. Then you record the first king, Alulim, who ruled in Eridu, and his reign length, 28,800 years, not 28 years, not even 288 years, 28,800 years, almost 29 millennia for a single reign. But you don't stop there because the records you're consulting don't stop there. The second king, Alalgar, also ruled in Eridu. His reign, 36,000 years. The third king, Enmedluana, another 43,200 years. You continue down the list. Enmenegalana, 28,800 years. Dumuzi the shepherd, 36,000 years. 8 kings in total before the flood, all ruling for impossible spans of time. When you add them up, these 8 antediluvian kings, these rulers from before the flood, supposedly governed for a combined total of 241,200 years. Nearly 250,000 years of recorded history before the great catastrophe that supposedly wiped everything away. Then something extraordinary happens in the text. The King List states it plainly. The flood swept over. Just like that, matter of fact, historical, not metaphorical, not symbolic. The flood swept over. And then, after the flood had swept over and the kingship had descended from heaven, the kingship was in Kish, a new city, a new beginning. But here's where it gets really interesting. The kings after the flood. Their reign lengths immediately become more reasonable. Still long by modern standards, the first king after the flood supposedly ruled for 1,200 years, but that's practically normal compared to the 28,800-year reigns we were seeing before. And with each subsequent generation, the numbers continue to drop. Within a few dynasties, you're seeing reign lengths of a few hundred years, then under 100, and eventually, by the time you get to kings whose reigns can be verified by other historical sources, the numbers match up perfectly with what we'd expect. 20 years, 35 years, 15 years. Normal human lifespans. It's like watching a fantasy gradually transform into documented history right before your eyes. Multiple versions of this king list have been found. They're not identical, the numbers vary somewhat between versions, but the overall structure is always the same. Impossibly long reigns before the flood, gradually decreasing reigns after the flood, eventually reaching verifiable historical periods with accurate reign lengths. The most complete version we have is the Weld-Blundell prism, discovered in the 1920s. It's a clay prism about 8 inches tall, covered in tiny cuneiform script on all 4 sides. It sits in the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford today. You can go look at it. Hold a flashlight at the right angle, and you can still read those impossible numbers carved into clay over 4,000 years ago. So, what do we make of this? The easy answer, the one most academics settled on decades ago, is that it's pure mythology. The Sumerians were trying to give themselves an impressively ancient pedigree. They invented legendary kings with impossible reign lengths to make their civilization seem older and more prestigious than it really was. The gradually decreasing reign lengths simply represent a transition from mythological prehistory to actual history as they reach periods where real records existed. Case closed. Mystery solved, let's move on, but wait a minute. Let's think about this more carefully, because there are some things about the King List that don't fit neatly into the "it's just mythology" box. First, the Sumerians weren't stupid. They were brilliant mathematicians, capable astronomers, sophisticated engineers. They kept meticulous records of everything: crop yields, trade transactions, celestial observations. They understood numbers better than almost anyone in the ancient world. When they recorded a king's reign as 1,200 years versus 12 years, they knew those were vastly different numbers. They weren't confused about time measurement. Second, the list doesn't read like mythology. Compare it to actual Sumerian myths and you'll see the difference immediately. Their myths are full of gods, monsters, magical events, cosmic battles. The King List, it's dry, administrative. It lists cities, names, and numbers. That's it. No dragons, no magic, no divine interventions beyond that initial statement about kingship descending from heaven. It reads like what it claims to be, a historical record. Third, and this is crucial, the list doesn't just suddenly become accurate when it reaches verified history. The transition is gradual. The reign lengths decrease slowly over many generations. It's like watching a logarithmic scale gradually transform into a linear one. That's a weird thing to do if you're just making up mythology. Why not just have a clear break? Mythology, then flood, then history. Why the gradual transition? Some researchers have suggested the numbers represent something other than years. Maybe they were counting lunar months instead of solar years. If you divide those 28,800-year reigns by 12, you get 2,400 years. Still impossibly long for a human life, but at least we're in the realm of mythological exaggeration rather than complete fantasy. Others have proposed that the numbers represent dynasties or lineages rather than individual rulers. Maybe Alulim wasn't one king who ruled for 28,800 years, but rather the Alulim dynasty that ruled for that long, with many individual kings whose names weren't recorded. The Sumerian language can be ambiguous about such things. But here's the problem with both these explanations. They assume the Sumerians were either incompetent at keeping records or deliberately obscuring the truth. And we know from thousands of other Sumerian documents that they were neither incompetent nor deceptive. When they recorded business transactions, the numbers are accurate. When they recorded astronomical observations, their data is verifiable. When they recorded the reigns of later kings, the lengths match up with other historical sources perfectly. So why would they suddenly become wildly inaccurate or intentionally misleading only when recording their earliest history? There's another possibility, one that's more controversial but worth considering. What if the numbers are corrupted, not invented? What if the Sumerians were working from older records, documents, or oral traditions from that pre-flood civilization they kept talking about, and something went wrong in the translation? Think about it. If there really was an advanced civilization before the flood, one that kept records, and if those records somehow survived and were later found by the early Sumerians, there's no guarantee they could read them perfectly. Languages evolve. Number systems change. What if they misunderstood the notation system? What if they correctly copied numbers but didn't realize those numbers represented something different than they assumed? We've made similar mistakes in our own time. When Europeans first encountered Mayan calendar inscriptions, they wildly misinterpreted the numbers because they didn't understand the mathematical system being used. It took decades to figure it out. What if the Sumerians were facing the same problem with documents from their own distant past? The King List itself seems to acknowledge that something unusual was going on before the flood. It doesn't just record long-reign lengths. It also emphasizes that these early kings ruled when kingship descended from heaven. That phrase appears repeatedly. It's like they're trying to indicate that this was a different era with different rules. Archaeological evidence from the Sumerian period doesn't help much. We haven't found any 28,800-year-old royal tombs, obviously, but we also haven't found anything that definitively proves the King List is pure invention. The cities it mentions as pre-flood sites, like Eridu and Bad Tabira, they're real places, among the oldest settlements in Mesopotamia. The cultural continuity is there, even if we can't verify the specific rulers or their reign lengths. What's particularly intriguing is that other ancient cultures have similar traditions. The Egyptian historian Manetho recorded Egyptian dynasties going back tens of thousands of years, with early divine kings who ruled for impossibly long periods. Ancient Hindu texts describe yugas, vast cycles of time spanning hundreds of thousands of years. The ancient Greeks had their own traditions of earlier ages when humans lived much longer. It's almost like there was a widespread ancient belief that time worked differently in the distant past, or that humans themselves were different somehow. Longer lived, maybe. Or perhaps the survivors of the flood genuinely believed, based on whatever fragmentary information they had, that the pre-flood world operated under different rules. The King List forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. Questions that don't have easy answers. Were the Sumerians recording garbled memories of real events they no longer fully understood? Were they preserving corrupted data from records they couldn't properly interpret? Or were they simply doing what every ancient civilization did, inventing an impressively ancient past to legitimize their present? The truth is, we don't know. What we do know is that the Sumerians themselves took this list seriously. They copied it, preserved it, passed it down through generations. To them, it was history, not myth, not metaphor, history. A record of the world as it was before everything changed, before the flood swept over and reset human civilization. And that belief, that conviction that there was a world before this one, a civilization lost to catastrophe, shaped everything else they recorded about the antediluvian period. What they preserved about the knowledge, the technologies, the way of life that supposedly existed in those impossibly ancient days. Which brings us to the real question. What did the Sumerians believe that Lost World was actually like? According to the Sumerian tablets, the world before the flood wasn't a vague, mythical golden age. It was surprisingly specific, detailed, almost bureaucratic. When you line up the different texts, the Eridu Genesis, Atrahasis, the Sumerian King List, scattered hymns and administrative tablets, you don't just get a story, you get a system, and that system begins with a single idea the Sumerians repeat over and over. Civilization was not invented by humans, it was lowered from heaven. In the Sumerian worldview, there was a time when the earth was wild, unorganized. No cities, no kings, no temples. Then, in a moment that sounds more like a planned rollout than a divine miracle, the me, the divine blueprints for civilization, are sent down from the gods. City appear. Not gradually, not tentatively, but as fully formed packages. Eridu, Bad Tabira, Larak, Sippar, Shrupak. The tablets list them like entries in a ledger. After kingship was lowered from heaven, Kingship was in Eridu. When Eridu falls, it moves to Bad Tabira, then to Larak, and so on. Each city isn't just a collection of houses, it's a node in a network, a place where divine authority, agriculture, ritual, law, and specialized knowledge converge. From the Sumerian perspective, this is what life before the flood looks like, a chain of advanced city-states stretching across the southern Mesopotamian plain, each ruled by a king who doesn't simply govern. He mediates between humans and the Anunnaki, and those Anunnaki are everywhere. In these texts, the Anunnaki aren't vague sky spirits. They have assignments, territories, job descriptions. Some oversee waters, some oversee crops, some oversee the black-headed people, the Sumerian name for humanity. The world before the flood is not a free-for-all. It is a managed project. The tablets are obsessed with order, canals are dug, fields are measured out, boundaries are established. There are lists of offerings, lists of rations, lists of workers. Even the earliest administrative tablets we've found are full of grain counts, livestock tallies, and labour quotas. To the Sumerians, pre-flood life is civilized life, irrigated, organised, centralised. They talk about agriculture not as an accidental discovery but as a gift. In the myths, the gods decide that humans will carry the basket, irrigate the fields, maintain the temples. Agriculture is framed as a contract. Humans get food, security, and access to divine knowledge. The gods get labour, loyalty, and a steady flow of offerings. But that contract has fine print. In Atrahasis, there's an earlier phase before humans, when the lesser gods do the work. They dig the canals, maintain the dikes, farm the land for the great gods. After thousands of years, they reach their breaking point. They mutiny. They surround the house of Enlil, the chief god, demanding relief. The solution is radical, a new species. The text describes a council of gods gathering to solve their labour problem. They decide to create Luman, a mixed being who can bear the workload. A god is sacrificed, his blood mixed with clay, and from this blend humans are formed. They are explicitly described as workers, servants, a labour-saving device for the divine elite. Some researchers look at this scene and see nothing more than mythic poetry. Others see something stranger, the language of mixture, of taking divine essence and fusing it with earthly material. The repeated Sumerian use of words that can be translated as design, prescription, destiny, decree. For some, this sounds like a symbolic echo of genetic manipulation, a story about beings with the power to alter life itself, told in the only language Bronze Age people had. The tablets don't use our words for DNA or genes, but they do talk about fixing the form of humans, determining their fate, creating them according to a pattern. They describe humans as a deliberate solution to an engineering problem, how to get more labour out of the earth without overworking the gods. Whether you take that literally or metaphorically, it paints a very specific picture of pre-flood existence. Humanity is designed to work, and work they do. The Sumerian King List says some of the antediluvian rulers reigned for tens of thousands of years. Alulim of Eridu, 28,800 years. Al-Algar, 36,000. Others follow with similarly impossible lifespans. From a modern perspective, these are obviously not calendar years in any normal sense. But why use such extreme numbers at all? To some, it's just mythic exaggeration, a way of signalling that these figures belong to a remote sacred past. To others, it hints that the pre-flood world operated on different terms, perhaps a different way of counting time, perhaps something stranger, a memory of beings who simply did not age like ordinary humans. Whoever they were, they ruled cities that the texts describe as sophisticated, prosperous, and deeply integrated with the rhythms of the cosmos. Because the tablets don't only talk about fields and bricks, They talk about the sky. In Sumerian and especially later Mesopotamian texts, the heavens are mapped like an enormous clock. Constellations are grouped into 3 paths of the gods. The ecliptic is divided into sectors. Tablets from later periods preserve star catalogues, planetary omens, eclipse cycles. Traditional scholarship says this astronomical system took centuries to develop, but the myths insist that its roots go back before the flood. They speak of the plans of heaven and earth established in the earlier cities. They describe Enki, the god of wisdom, as mastering numbers, measures, and weights, organizing the cosmos through mathematics. Some fragments hint that knowledge of the stars was part of the original me brought down from the heavens, not invented slowly from scratch, but revealed. If this is even partly true, it suggests that pre-flood Sumerian civilization, or the culture that preceded it, already possessed a structured understanding of astronomy and mathematics, enough to align temples with celestial events, to track seasonal cycles, to embed cosmic timing into ritual calendars. The same goes for medicine. Medical texts from historical Mesopotamia show a blend of herbal treatments, surgical procedures and incantations. Some remedies are so precise, specific plants, dosages, preparation methods, that they border on empirical science. The myths attribute this knowledge to specific gods and goddesses who are said to have established healing in the earliest temples. They don't say humans discovered medicine by trial and error. They say it was taught. Taken together, astronomy, mathematics, medicine, agriculture, city planning, the tablets create an image of pre-flood life that feels oddly modern. Specialized professions, codified knowledge, tools and techniques passed down through trained experts. The gods are portrayed less like distant abstract forces and more like administrators, engineers and teachers. But there is a cost to all this order. As the pre-flood cities expand, something starts to go wrong. In Atrahasis, the core problem isn't ignorance, it's excess. Humans multiply, they build, they farm, they fill the land, and as their numbers grow, so does their noise. The text describes this literally. The land bellowed like a bull. The god grew restless at their clamour. Enlil can't sleep. The chief god of air and wind is kept awake by the sound of his own creation. The response is brutal. First, plagues, then famine, then drought. Each disaster is an attempt to cull the human population, to restore a manageable balance. Each time humans are helped by another god, usually Enki, the trickster, the engineer, the one who has always been closer to humanity. Secret instructions are given, rituals to end the plague, techniques to survive the famine, advice that undermines Enlil's harsh decrees. If you strip away the divine names, what you're left with sounds almost like a political crisis, a split among the ruling powers over how to handle the runaway consequences of their own system. One faction wants control through reduction. The other wants adaptation through knowledge. The tension escalates. In the flood accounts, the decision is finally made. Humans are too many, too noisy, too uncontrollable. Their impact on the world is too great. The solution is not another targeted disaster. It's a reset, a total wipeout. But even here, the pattern repeats. Enlil decrees destruction. Enki undermines it. He whispers to Atrahasis, to Ziusudra, to Utnapishtim. Different names in different versions, but always the same figure. A human who listens, who understands, who is capable of building something extraordinary when given the right information. In some versions, Enki speaks through a reed wall, careful not to technically break his oath of secrecy. In others, he appears in a dream. But the message is the same: measurements, dimensions, instructions. How to build a vessel that will survive a cataclysm that wipes out everything else. This is the final haunting theme of the pre-flood tablets. The idea that advanced knowledge, engineering, navigation, food storage, animal husbandry, even the selection of people, was deliberately concentrated in a tiny group right before the disaster. That, just as earlier gods compressed their own labour into a new species, a single god compresses the skills of an entire civilization into one family and one boat. When you step back, the Sumerian picture of the pre-flood world looks less like a fantasy and more like a blueprint for an advanced, tightly managed system that spun out of control. Cities planned, workers created, knowledge bestowed, population growth, environmental pressure, internal conflict among the elites, a final, catastrophic reset with a select archive of knowledge smuggled through the chaos. Is it all metaphor? A way for ancient people to make sense of floods, famines, and the rise and fall of cities? Or is it a dim, distorted memory of something stranger, of an early, highly organized civilization whose technical skills and social engineering were far ahead of what we usually imagine for that time? The tablets don't answer that for us. They just whisper over and over that before the flood there was order, there was knowledge, there were cities, kings, teachers, and plans, and when the waters came, most of it vanished, but maybe not all. If the Sumerian tablets are remembering something real, where is it? Clay remembers stories. Stone remembers water. To find the flood behind the myth, archaeologists had to stop reading tablets and start digging into the ground that produced them, and when they did, they found something strange. In the 1920s, a British archaeologist named Leonard Woolley went looking for the oldest city in Sumer, the supposed home of Abraham, the city of moon temples and royal tombs. He expected palaces, temples, jewellery, maybe some tablets. He did not expect to hit a wall of mud. As Woolley dug down through the layers of Ur's history, he passed through centuries of human life. Brick platforms, broken pottery, ash from ancient fires. Each layer a page in the city's autobiography. People building, farming, worshipping, dying. Then suddenly, nothing. Just a thick, sterile band of clay. No pottery, no ash, no bones, no tools. It was as if, for a moment in time, human presence had simply vanished from that spot. Beneath that silent layer, much deeper, he eventually found traces of an earlier settlement. Cruder pottery, more primitive structures, a different world. Between those two human worlds sat a band of pure river silt, nearly 3 meters thick in some places. Woolley knew exactly what that meant. Water. Not a gentle change of course. A catastrophe. He called it the flood layer. Woolley believed he had found physical evidence of the very event described in the Mesopotamian flood stories. The deluge that wiped out the old world and cleared the stage for a new one. To many at the time, it felt like the Bible and the tablets had just been vindicated by a shovel. But then other archaeologists started digging. At the ancient city of Kish, north of excavators also found a significant flood deposit, a thick band of water-laid clay separating older, simpler levels from later, more developed ones. At Unpack, the city explicitly named in the Atrahasis story as the place doomed by the god's flood. Archaeologists uncovered signs of heavy flooding around the mid-3rd millennium BCE. Mud, debris, disrupted building layers. Different sites, different depths, different dates. The Earth was telling a more complicated story. Instead of one universal layer of destruction stretching across all of Mesopotamia at exactly the same time, researchers found multiple flood layers in different cities from different centuries. Some separated older cultures from newer ones, some seemed local, others more extensive. So what were these exactly? We know the Tigris and Euphrates are not gentle rivers. They swell, they shift, they break their banks. Seasonal floods are normal in river valleys, but these layers weren't just seasonal, They were massive enough to bury streets, homes, entire neighborhoods, enough to force people to rebuild from scratch, sometimes higher up, sometimes in slightly different places. Geologists studying those clays could see the signature of high-energy water, fast, violent, choked with sediment. Not a slow rising tide, but something sudden and overwhelming. Imagine living in a city of mud brick walls and reed roofs. One year the floods don't stop at the fields. The river rises and keeps rising. Houses dissolve. Streets turn to churning channels of water. Things you thought were permanent, temples, granaries, city walls, vanish in days. If you survived that, what story would you tell your children? Maybe you'd say, once, long ago, the gods decided to wash the world clean, and if, centuries later, another city downriver suffered its own disastrous flood, its people might tell a similar story. Over time, separate disasters could merge in memory, blending into a single, world-ending event. Individual floods become the flood. That's one possibility. But the story doesn't stop at Mesopotamia's riverbanks. When scientists looked beyond Iraq and Syria, they found other traces of ancient water on a different scale entirely. Not just city floods, regional transformations. As the last ice age ended around 12,000 to 8,000 years ago, enormous ice sheets that had locked up much of the world's water began to melt. Sea levels rose not by centimetres, but by more than 100 metres over several thousand years. It wasn't instant, but in human terms it was fast enough to drown coastlines that had been inhabited for generations. Villages that once sat comfortably above the shore found themselves closer and closer to the waves. Fields became marsh. Marsh became shallow bay. Then, one day, nothing remained above water. We can't see those villages easily today, because they are under the sea. Off the coast of India, in the Gulf of Kambat, sonar surveys have detected what may be the outlines of ancient structures on the seabed. Straight lines, geometric shapes, patterns that don't look purely natural. Off the coast of Japan, at Yonaguni, massive stone-like formations have sparked debates. Are they entirely natural formations, or did human hands enhance them? In the Mediterranean, near places like Atlit Yam, off the coast of Israel, we do have clear evidence. Submerged Neolithic villages, stone wells, human skeletons, all now under several metres of seawater. These aren't cities that sank in an afternoon. They're the victims of a planet slowly thawing. Still, for the people who once lived there, the experience might have felt anything but slow. A grandparent's stories of fields and villages in places where, by their grandchildren's time, only fish swam. Again, what kind of story captures that? Nowhere is this idea more dramatic than in what's known as the Black Sea Deluge hypothesis. Today, the Black Sea is a large inland sea connected to the Mediterranean by a narrow strait. But evidence suggests that, at the end of the Ice Age, it may have been a much smaller, mostly freshwater lake, isolated and lower than the world ocean. Then, as global sea levels rose, the Mediterranean crept up the Bosporus. At some point, according to one influential theory, the rising Mediterranean finally spilled over into the lower Black Sea basin in a cataclysmic event. Instead of a trickle, imagine a waterfall, water roaring in, eroding, widening the channel, flooding the basin, raising the Black Sea level dozens of metres in a relatively short geological time. If that really happened the way some geologists think, entire shorelines would have been swallowed. Settlements around the old lake margin might have watched the horizon change week by week, month by month. Places that had always been land became sea. Some researchers have speculated that this could be the origin of later Near Eastern flood traditions, a memory of a great inland deluge, preserved and reshaped by migrating peoples. Others are more cautious, pointing out that the details, timing, and even the violence of the event are still debated. Not all geologists agree on how sudden the Black Sea rise was, or how populated its shores were at the time. Once again, the evidence is suggestive, but not conclusive. Back in Mesopotamia itself, geological fieldwork paints a picture of a landscape prone to chaos. Cores taken from ancient floodplains show repeated layers of silt deposited by major floods, sometimes stacked like pages in a book. Flood, stability, flood, stability. Each band tells of a time when the rivers broke free, spreading destruction far beyond their normal channels. Some of these layers show signs of extreme events, sudden deposits so thick and extensive that they suggest truly exceptional floods, perhaps driven by rare combinations of snowmelt, heavy rain, and changing river courses. To the people who lived through them, these weren't just big floods. They were the water equivalent of the sky falling. That fits uncomfortably well with the tablet stories, gods deciding the world has become too noisy, too chaotic, then sending a storm so intense that even the gods themselves are afraid of its power. Wind, rain, darkness, and finally, silence. Yet when archaeologists try to match a specific flood layer to a specific story, the flood at Unpack to Atrahasis, for example, the results remain frustratingly blurry. Dates wobble by centuries. Sites show different intensities at different times. No single layer cleanly blankets all of Mesopotamia in one obvious apocalyptic event. So, does the Earth support the idea of a global flood that covered every mountain, as some later traditions claim? Geology is pretty clear here. There is no evidence of a worldwide ocean suddenly drowning all land within any time frame compatible with human civilization. Rock layers, ice cores, fossil records, none of them show signs of a recent universal deluge. If we're strict with the data, the tablets are not describing a global event in a literal sense. But that doesn't mean they're talking about something trivial. Instead, the evidence points to a world where catastrophic floods were real, recurrent, and sometimes civilization-altering, especially in low-lying river valleys like Mesopotamia and along coasts reshaped by rising post-Ice Age seas. Cities like Ur, Kish, Shuruppak, and others bear scars of major inundations. Geological cores reveal episodes when rivers transformed entire landscapes in months or years. Underwater archaeology hints at communities erased by the creeping, relentless rise of the oceans. Put all this together, and a pattern emerges. Not one global flood, but many devastating floods, scattered in time and space, imprinting themselves again and again on human memory. In such a world, is it surprising that the Sumerians spoke of a time before the flood and after the flood, as if a single watery boundary divided history in two? Is it surprising that kings before the flood are said to reign for impossible spans, tens of thousands of years, as if they belong to a different order of existence? When water wipes your world clean, the survivors may feel that everything that came before belongs to another age entirely. The tablets remember a great rupture. The soil remembers many. Maybe the Mesopotamian flood narratives are like reflections in a pool, distorted but rooted in something solid. A mosaic of real disasters compressed into one overwhelming story. Or perhaps, as some speculate, they preserve echoes of even older, regional transformations, like the drowning of ancient coastlines or the surging of the Black Sea, carried forward by migrating peoples and woven into local myth. When we compare the text to the trenches, both agreement and tension appear. Yes, there were enormous floods. Yes, they changed lives, cities, maybe entire cultures. No, they were not global in the literal sense. So what were the Sumerians really trying to preserve on their tablets? A meteorological event, or a memory of the world ending and beginning again in the only terms that mattered to them? As we move deeper into the mystery, another question emerges. If the flood was a boundary, what crossed it? What knowledge, what stories, what fragments of a drowned world made it onto those clay tablets on the far shore of catastrophe? Imagine the world standing on the edge of destruction. The rivers are swelling. The rains no longer come in seasons. They just come. The sky is wrong. The winds are wrong. The calendar, the stars, the predictable rhythms that your ancestors had relied on for generations all begin to slip out of alignment. And somewhere in ancient Mesopotamia, a group of scribes, priests, and rulers seems to realize something terrifying. This isn't just a bad year. This is the end of an age. According to several Mesopotamian texts, the flood wasn't just a punishment. It was a dividing line, a reset button, a boundary between the world before and the world after. And when you read those tablets carefully, something strange keeps appearing between the lines. Plans, preparations, deliberate attempts to keep knowledge alive when everything else was about to be washed away. In the Sumerian King List, the kings before the flood are not just rulers. They are custodians of something. They receive me, the divine decrees that control civilization, kingship, truth, weaving, metalwork, writing, law, music. The list tells us that kingship descended from heaven to Eridu. Civilization is not discovered. It is handed down, entrusted. So what happens when the gods decide to send a flood? Some texts hint that the knowledge is not meant to vanish with the water. In the Akkadian version of Atrahasis, the wise man who will later survive the flood is warned in secret. He's told to dismantle his house to build a boat to save the seed of all living things. Most people focus on the animals, the pears, the livestock. But the phrase seed of all living things could imply more than biology. It could mean the seed of culture, the seed of knowledge, the mental DNA of civilization. Later Mesopotamian commentary traditions suggest exactly that. There are references to tablets of the before time, to instructions and wisdom that existed prior to the flood and somehow made it through. In some versions of the story of Zeus Sudra, the Sumerian flood hero, he is not just praised for piety. He is praised for wisdom, for understanding, as if part of his role is not only to live through the catastrophe, but to carry something crucial with him across the boundary: knowledge. When you follow this thread, you start to see a pattern: legends of preserved wisdom, hidden records, secret libraries, sealed containers, not only in Mesopotamia but all over the world. Later, Babylonian stories talk about antediluvian sages, the Apkallu, semi-divine wise ones who lived before the flood, taught humanity writing, agriculture, temple building, and then, according to some traditions, inscribed their knowledge on tablets and stored them in foundations and hidden chambers so they would not be lost when the waters came. In one version, each Apkallu serves a pre-flood king, guiding him, advising him, building cities, designing temples. After the flood, those perfect sages disappear, replaced by human, fallible counterparts. The message is subtle but clear. Something was lost. Something had to be rebuilt. But some trace of the old knowledge survived, embedded in texts, rituals, measurements, sacred architecture, and the idea of sealed knowledge, set aside for a future world, keeps echoing in other traditions. Jewish mystical literature speaks of Enoch, a righteous figure taken up before the flood. In some texts he writes books of wisdom, astronomy, calendar systems, and divine secrets, and passes them to his descendants. These books are explicitly before the flood teachings. In later stories, some of those books are hidden, buried, or sealed, waiting to be rediscovered when humanity is ready. In Islamic tradition, there are legends of pre-flood scrolls and tablets preserved by prophets, then carried on the ark. In some versions, Adam himself receives heavenly scriptures that are later protected and passed down through generations until the deluge. Greek sources preserve rumors of Egyptian priests claiming their records stretched back not just centuries, but entire cycles of destruction and renewal. They speak of sacred writings kept in temple archives, protected through fires and floods, copied again and again so they wouldn't be erased when the world was. The city might fall, the dynasty might end, but the knowledge would be carried into the next age, ink pressed into fresh papyrus, carved again into stone. In India, stories of the Great Flood describe Manu, the primordial man, who is warned about the coming waters and saves not just living beings, but also the laws, rituals, and sacred hymns that will structure human society in the world that follows. In some versions, these teachings are preserved in memory, in recitation, in tightly guarded oral traditions that survive when written records do not. Different names, different gods, different languages. But the same strange idea. Someone knew the flood was coming, and someone tried to save more than just bodies. They tried to save instructions, a pattern, a blueprint for civilization. Mesopotamian traditions go even further. They talk about hidden libraries and buried wisdom in very concrete ways. Later, Assyrian kings like Ashurbanipal boast that they collected writings from before the flood, claiming to have rescued ancient knowledge from earlier ages. Whether this was literal or royal propaganda, the concept is striking. The idea that deep beneath the layers of current power, there once existed a more ancient archive, and that fragments of it could still be found if you dug in the right place. Modern archaeologists have, in a sense, confirmed part of this picture. Not the pre-flood tablets themselves, but the habit of burying knowledge. Foundation deposits, clay tablets, inscribed cones, miniature objects were sealed inside walls, under temples, beneath city gates. They carried not just names and dedications, but sometimes rituals, building specifications, even warnings to future kings. Messages sent forward in time through the rubble of future collapses. If a city was destroyed, the visible archives could burn, but deep in a foundation trench, a clay tablet might survive, silent, waiting. Now imagine that habit not as an isolated practice, but as a continuation of something older, a memory, perhaps dim, of an even earlier attempt to keep knowledge safe when a much larger disaster loomed. And this raises a tantalizing question. When we look at early Sumerian achievements, sophisticated astronomy, surprisingly precise measurements of time, complex legal concepts, advanced irrigation systems, are we looking at the first awkward steps of a new civilization figuring everything out from scratch? Or are we seeing a reconstruction, a rebuilding based on fragments of instructions, half-remembered formulas, broken sequences of ritual and number that were carried through the flood and then painstakingly reassembled? If the Sumerians themselves believed that kingship descended from heaven and that the me of civilization were gifts from before the flood, did they see their culture as an invention or as a recovery? Some researchers have pointed to odd discontinuities in the archaeological record, things that appear too early, too fully formed, the sudden emergence of cuneiform writing with complex symbolic systems, the rapid standardization of weights and measures, temple plans that seem to follow consistent ratios and orientations as if obeying rules that were already worked out somewhere else. Mainstream scholarship explains this through social complexity, experimentation, and the natural acceleration of cultural evolution once certain thresholds are crossed. And that explanation fits much of the evidence. But those ancient texts sit alongside the artifacts, whispering a different possibility. That the people of Sumer did not see themselves as the first. They saw themselves as heirs to a world that had ended, heirs to scribes and sages who had lived in cities that now lay under river sediments, beneath new layers of brick and mud and time, heirs to teaching said to be from before the flood, perhaps distorted, perhaps mythologized, but still carrying a kernel of something older than the civilization we can excavate. The idea of antediluvian wisdom keepers appears again and again. In Mesopotamia, the Apkallu. In Jewish and Christian traditions, Enoch and the sons of God. In Islamic lore, pre-flood prophets. In Indian texts, ancient rishis. In Mesoamerican myths, culture heroes who survive floods and bring back calendar knowledge, agricultural secrets, and sacred stories. Always the same role. They are not just survivors, they are librarians of a dying world. If even a fraction of those myths preserve a distorted memory of real strategies, oral traditions, carved inscriptions, hidden caches of objects, then advanced knowledge could, in principle, survive a massive regional catastrophe. Writing baked onto clay can endure where flesh and wood cannot. Architectural principles can be encoded in rituals, in geometry, in the way a temple is laid out to mirror the sky. And once the flood recedes, the survivors begin again. They build new cities on the ruins of the old. They dig foundations into older layers, sometimes disturbing, sometimes unknowingly preserving remnants of what came before. They tell stories about a time when humans lived longer, ruled longer, knew more. A golden age drowned by divine anger or by forces of nature too overwhelming to comprehend. So when we read those Sumerian tablets today, when we see their advanced mathematics, their star catalogues, their precise rituals, we can ask, is this the beginning of civilization, or the second draft? The truth may be simpler or stranger. The tablets do not give us a clear answer. They speak in symbols, divine decrees, legendary kings, sacred sages. They blur history and myth into a single continuous narrative, but they refuse stubbornly to let the idea of pre-flood knowledge die. Somewhere in their view, wisdom was carried across the waters, on an ark, in the memory of a survivor, in sealed tablets buried deep beneath the foundations of a new city that would one day be called Eridu, or Uruk, or Nippur. And if that's even partially true, then the question we're left with is unsettling. How much of what we call Sumerian genius was really an inheritance from a world we can no longer see? Now zoom out from Mesopotamia for a moment. Step back from clay tablets and royal lists and imagine the whole planet as a kind of memory palace. Different languages, different gods, different landscapes. But scattered through all these cultures is one strangely familiar echo. A world covered by water, a handful of survivors, a new beginning. You've already heard the Sumerian version. Angry gods, a chosen man, a boat, a reset. But Sumer wasn't alone. Stories that sound uncannily similar appear in places that, for most of history, had no contact with each other at all. Start in the highlands of Anatolia and the Levant. The Hebrews would later write about Noah in Genesis. God sees that humanity has become corrupt, decides to cleanse the world with a flood, warns a single righteous man, commands him to build an ark, to gather animals in pairs, to ride out the waters until they recede. When the boat finally grounds on a mountain, he sends out birds, steps onto dry land, and begins again. A covenant, a fresh start. Move east into India. In ancient Vedic tradition, there is the story of Manu. One day, Manu rescues a tiny fish from a drying puddle. The fish speaks. It warns him that a great flood is coming that will wash away all life. In return for his kindness, the fish, who is really a god in disguise, tells Manu to build a boat and to bring along the seeds of every living thing. When the waters rise, the fish tows the boat to safety, anchored to a mountain top. When the flood recedes, Manu becomes the ancestor of a renewed human race. Head further east to China. One of the oldest Chinese legends tells of a world-destroying flood that rose up until the waters touched the heavens. The hero is sometimes called Yu the Great, a figure who fights not just to survive, but to tame the waters themselves. He digs channels, directs rivers, reclaims land from chaos. In some versions, the flood is punishment. In others, it's a cosmic accident. But the pattern is familiar. Catastrophe, a single heroic figure, reshaping the world so that human life can continue. Cross the oceans to the Pacific, to the islands of Polynesia. On Hawaii, there's a story of Nu'u, a man warned that the world will be flooded. He builds a great canoe with a house on it. The waters rise, cover the earth, and Nu'u's vessel finally comes to rest on a mountaintop. He steps out into a cleansed world and begins anew. Sail south to Australia. Among some Aboriginal groups, there are dreaming stories where the sea rises and swallows coastal lands, forcing people to retreat and adapt. In other traditions along the Australian coast, there are tales of ancestral lands now under the water, remembered not as mythic fantasy, but as something that used to be there, and then wasn't. Travel to the Americas. In Mesoamerica, the Maya tell of earlier ages of the world destroyed by floods before the current era of humans. Among the Aztecs, one age ends in water, forcing a small group to survive by transforming into fish. In the Andes, Inca tradition speaks of a time when the earth was drowned and only a couple survived in a sealed cave or on a high mountain, eventually repopulating the land. Further north, among Native American peoples, flood stories are everywhere. The Hopi speak of previous worlds destroyed by fire and flood, with a chosen group ushered into safety through the guidance of spiritual beings. Some Pacific Northwest tribes talk about waters that rose over the tops of the mountains, and a few individuals who survived by lashing their canoes to the highest peaks, waiting until the raging waters dropped. Anthropologists who've tried to count these traditions have found flood stories in over 200 cultures worldwide. Some are vague. A great storm, a rising sea, a village wiped out. Others are hauntingly detailed. A divine warning, a specific vessel, instructions to preserve animals or seeds, a long period of darkness and water, a final grounding on high land, a ritual or sacrifice, and then a new human lineage beginning from a tiny remnant of survivors. Step back and look at the shared elements. A warning, usually from a god, a spirit, or a strange talking animal. A chosen person or small group, often described as particularly righteous, wise, or favoured. A container of survival. A boat, a canoe, an ark, a raft, sometimes even a floating house or a hollow tree. The preservation of life. Pairs of animals, seeds of every plant, sacred objects, knowledge for rebuilding. Waters that rise unnaturally high, covering the whole earth, or all the lands the people knew. A landing on elevated ground, a mountain, a hill, the one place the water couldn't quite swallow, and finally, a new beginning, a sacrifice, a promise, a law, a covenant, a warning that this must never happen again, or that it might if people forget. So how do we explain this pattern? Did all these cultures independently invent almost the same story? Or are they all dimly remembering something that really happened? One possibility is simple convergence. Water is dangerous. Humans have always lived near rivers, lakes, coasts, places that flood. In a small farming village, a single catastrophic flood can feel like the end of the world. If your valley is everything you know, and one day it turns into an ocean, you might naturally describe that as the whole world drowning. Over thousands of years, ordinary disasters can grow into cosmic ones. A local flood turns into the flood. There's also a psychological angle. Floods are a perfect metaphor for chaos. water washing away the old, making room for the new. If you're trying to tell a story about moral failure and second chances, about destruction and rebirth, what better image than a world submerged and then revealed again, clean and empty, waiting to be repopulated? From this perspective, the similarities between flood myths might not point to a single historical event at all. They might reflect the common human experience of living with unpredictable water, plus a shared tendency to wrap moral lessons in dramatic, unforgettable narratives. But there's another possibility, one that's harder to prove, but harder to ignore. What if some of these stories really are memories? Not perfect, not precise, but distorted recollections of real floods so massive, so unprecedented, that they seared themselves into oral traditions for thousands of years. We know that the end of the last ice age was anything but gentle. As huge ice sheets melted, sea levels rose more than 100 meters, coastlines retreated, entire landscapes vanished beneath encroaching oceans. The plains where your ancestors once hunted might now lie under the waves, miles offshore. For people living at the time, the sea wouldn't have risen in a single night. But there were pulses, meltwater surges, abrupt shifts. Storms and tsunamis could have driven walls of water far inland. Glacial lakes sometimes burst out catastrophically, releasing floods that reshaped entire regions in a matter of days. Stand in front of that, and it doesn't feel like ordinary bad weather. It feels like the world ending. In Mesopotamia itself, rivers like the Tigris and Euphrates have always been unpredictable. Archaeologists have identified layers of riverborne silt in ancient cities, traces of huge regional floods that could easily have inspired the Sumerian and Babylonian stories. Not a flood that covered the whole planet, but one that, to the people living there, might as well have. So the question becomes, are all these global flood stories just coincidences built from common human fears? Or are they fragments of a shared human memory, piecewise recollections of extreme floods at different times and places, stitched together over generations into one archetypal story? Scholars are divided. Many argue that the differences between myths are as important as the similarities. Some have no divine warning, others have no boat. Some speak of endless rain, others of the sea rising, others of a broken sky. It's easy, they point out, to cherry-pick details until everything looks alike, and human imagination is more than capable of inventing powerful symbols without any historical core. But there's also the stubborn fact of distribution. Why does a story about the world drowning, a tiny remnant surviving, and a new epoch beginning show up again and again on every inhabited continent, across cultures that developed in complete isolation for tens of thousands of years? Maybe there is a middle ground. Perhaps there was no single, global, all-encompassing flood, but there were many enormous regional disasters. Maybe the people who lived through them encoded their experiences in stories. Those stories were told and retold, reshaped, exaggerated, moralized. They spread along trade routes, through migrations, across language boundaries. In some places they fused with local experiences of flood. In others they were framed as divine judgment or cosmic reset. By the time scribes in Sumer pressed their styluses into wet clay, the flood story they recorded might already have been ancient, already a composite of events and ideas older than any city, older than writing itself. If that's true, then global flood myths are more than just moral parables. They're echoes of how deeply environmental catastrophe can carve itself into the human mind. They suggest that when the world changes violently, when coastlines vanish, when rivers swallow cities, when old lands disappear, humans don't just adapt physically, they adapt narratively. They build stories sturdy enough to carry their memories across thousands of years. And here's the unsettling implication. If these tales do preserve even a blurred memory of real floods, then the Sumerian tablets might not just be theological speculation. They might be the literate tip of a much older iceberg, one strand in a global tapestry of traditions all pointing back, in their own ways, to times when water rose and everything familiar was swept away. In that case, flood myths are not just about the past. They're about what happens when civilization stands on the edge of erasure, and a few survivors manage to carry knowledge and memory and story through to whatever comes after. So where does all of this leave us? On one side, we have clay tablets, fragile, cracked, baked in ancient fires and buried for thousands of years. They tell us about kings who reigned for tens of thousands of years, about cities that were old before history officially began, about a great flood that wiped the slate clean, and about knowledge carefully preserved and passed through the waters of catastrophe. On the other side, we have modern archaeology, radiocarbon dates, sediment cores, climate models, carefully excavated layers of mud and stone. They speak of rising seas at the end of the last ice age, of regional floods, of slowly developing agriculture, of cities that appear gradually, not all at once. Between these two worlds there's a gap, a space filled with questions. The Sumerian tablets insist there was a before the flood, a time of long-lived rulers, advanced organization, maybe even sophisticated knowledge that didn't fit the timeline we're used to. Mainstream scholars see myth, symbolism, exaggeration. Alternative researchers see memory, distortion, perhaps echoes of something real that we no longer fully understand. Both sides might be partly right, because myths are rarely pure invention. They grow out of something, a disaster that really happened but got bigger in the telling. A leader whose deeds became superhuman after generations of storytelling. A regional flood that felt like the end of the world to the people who survived it. Over centuries, those memories harden into scripture, into epic, into king lists carved into clay, and yet some details are stubborn. The precise way the Sumerians talk about knowledge before the flood, specialized wisdom given to a select few, lists of disciplines preserved and reactivated afterward. The idea that the gods, or someone, were concerned not just with saving lives, but with saving information. Why was knowledge so important to them? What exactly were they so afraid of losing? Did the pre-flood world really host cities and cultures that left almost no trace? Or are we hearing the distant echo of much older human struggles, with rising water, shifting climates, and collapsing ecosystems? Are the antediluvian kings memory fragments of early complex societies long since eroded away? Or are they pure symbolism, a way of saying, there was a time when everything was different? The tablets won't answer clearly. They hint, they suggest, they circle the truth without landing on it. They show us a civilization that already had history, and yet spoke as if its own beginning was only a faint reflection of something lost. That's the enduring mystery. How much of our forgotten past is truly gone, washed away by floods, buried beneath river deltas and continental shelves? How much is still waiting in unexcavated sites, in untranslated tablets, in oral traditions that have never been written down? And how much will always remain in that shadowy space between evidence and imagination, between what we can prove and what we can only suspect? To move forward, we need both skepticism and curiosity. We need the discipline of science, the careful work of archaeologists and historians. But we also need the willingness to ask uncomfortable questions, to look at an ancient story and wonder, quietly, what if there's more here than we think? The Sumerian tablets don't just tell us about a flood. They remind us how fragile memory is, how easily entire worlds can vanish, leaving only cryptic traces behind. They challenge us to see our own civilization differently, less permanent, more vulnerable, more connected to long cycles of rise, fall, and forgetting. As you drift towards sleep, let those questions stay with you, not as fears, but as invitations. There is still so much we don't know about who we are and where we truly come from. If you'd like to keep exploring these mysteries with me, gently tap like and consider subscribing so you don't miss the next journey into the deep past. And in the comments, let me know where you're listening from and which part of this forgotten world you'd most like to visit if you could. For now, rest well, descendant of survivors. The story of our past isn't finished. It's still being written, one discovery, one tablet, one question at a time.